So today we're very pleased to have Dr. Amedeo D'Angiulli, a co-investigator of the Pediatric Autism Research Cohort or PARC Study, who is going to talk to us about understanding communication and neurodevelopment through the imagination lenses. I'm very excited for today's talk. I think many of us have been looking forward to learning about this kind of approach and program of research. A little bit about Amedeo. Dr. Amedeo D'Angiulli is professor of developmental, social, and cognitive neuroscience at the Department of Neuroscience and director of the Neuroscience of Imagination, Cognition, and Emotion Research Lab at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He is lead scientist at Neurodevelopmental Health Unit at CHIO, an international virtual professor Nettuno University in Rome, Italy. Throughout his career, he received numerous awards such as the Killam Fellowship, Canada Research Chair Tier 2, and the UNESCO Fellowship in Learning Sciences. He has received numerous awards and funding from national and provincial agencies in Canada and internationally. He has over 200 research contributions of different kinds with over 100 peer-reviewed publications and serves or has served in the boards of several journals as associate, consulting editor, and reviewer or chief editor, as well as in boards of AI companies, schools, and non-profit NGOs. So we are delighted to have you with us today, Amedeo, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for the welcoming presentation. And I'd like to also acknowledge the Algonquin people, the unceded lands from which I'm talking, and Canada as independent country. So today I will talk about communication and neurodevelopment seen from the perspective of imagination. And I made the title a little bit more difficult through putting lenses because this has a reason. I'm using lenses as a tool. I'm using a perspective as a tool to reframe our ideas or some of the ideas that we have about children with autism. So I will be talking about the role of imagination in autism. And I will be saying, basically, I will be touching upon three things that are related with this topic. The theory of mind view imagination, which is the mainstream on the, let's say, the link between imagination and communication. I will talk about imagination and consciousness in autism, which is a somewhat of a less known or a less walked path in research and in practice. And I will introduce it mostly through neuroscience. And then I'll talk about some ideas and action items that come with taking this perspective on autism and neurodevelopment. And I hope that in that final conclusion, the presentation will be kind of a little bit more interactive and I can address questions within, talking about the conclusions. So what do we mean by imaginations? Imagination includes various forms of skills, processes, and thinking, like pretend play, storytelling, figurative language, and the ability to envision or represent abstract concepts. In this map, this is the map of the entire literature or imagination in PubMed and Web of Science. This is a study that I did with one of my undergraduate students, Raymond Roy, in which we mapped the entire field of the literature using a method that is called social network analysis or bibliometric networks analysis. It tends to show nodes that are important as a size and at the center when they are more important, and it has all the connections with other and associations with other concepts that are related to the main topic. And as you can see, there is so much of skills and cognitive skills, emotional skills, and imagination covers so much of what we do as humans. And there is this clear link with creativity, which is important, and I'll talk about in a moment. But if you want to define the minimum essence of what it is to imagine, then the reality is imagination comes from being able of having a mental content, usually images, usually visual images, and synthesizing information from different sources. We call this mental synthesis. And to explain mental synthesis, I will use the drawing of one of Charles Darwin, a child, the frog mannequin holding a blue parasol umbrella, which is a very whimsical drawing of combining different concepts and in a visual drawing, a visual representation. And the mental synthesis is in having different categories of things and parts of representations all combined then in a product that is kind of new and it doesn't exist, but at the same time it combines different concepts and different pieces of information. Now, as I said, imagination is related to creativity, but it's not creativity. There is a lot of sort of confusion in terms of reducing all that is imagination to creativity, but the creativity is the ability to generate ideas and artifacts that are new, surprising, and valuable from the seminal definition of Margaret Bowden. But imagination doesn't have to be novel. For example, one example is imitation. Deferred or delayed imitation, in which we simulate parts of reality, parts of things that are external to us in perception, and they don't necessarily have to be novel or surprising to actually be useful, adaptive, or have a function for us. But essentially, it's also true that imagination is part of creativity. It's a little bit of that machinery that is beyond when we actually invent new things. As a mental synthesis, for example, that I've shown, you can combine things that are already present and that are already there and are part of reality in a new thing that is a new synthesis and is novel. And Raymond and I have written extensively and to make sure that there isn't that confound between creativity and imagination, we have called this ability of generate new synthesis of information imaginative generativity. Now, what is the role, what is the place of imagination in autism research? Well, this is work done with my student, Rachel Humes. We have used the same type of map that we used to, map the entire literature using keywords and using PubMed between 1964 and 2025 papers. There are 568 articles in the literature that exist in that span of time. And as you can see, imagination features quite extensively as a central node, and actually have a nice representation here that we can use, and it's a little bit more interesting to see than the map. So the node, its imagination is related to many other things like theory of mind and theory. And you can see that there are three main clusters or groups of meanings in the literature that are kind of found using this particular tool that we use to map the literature, which is a simple machine learning procedure and algorithm. And what you can see is on one side, you have theory of mind, imagination with all the cognitive aspects. And then on the other side, you have some sort of clinical, medical aspects that are related to it, where you have more of a deficit view of what imagination is for autism. Now, going back to the role of imagination in autism research, one mainstream, very followed and influential view is the one that, for example, has been put forward by Baron Cohen and Theory of Mind, in which I have his quote here and then the layman translation to kind of make sense in an academic way, in which he says the goal of Theory of Mind is not to explain repetitive behaviors, but primarily a deficit in imagination, which has something to do with communication impairments and is specific to autism. So it's unique, he says, it's unique to autism, and it's a deficit. So one really important aspect of autism for the theory of mind is this deficit in imagination. And the sort of the very famous way to describe the deficit is the failure in the theory of mind, Sally and Anne, where everything starts with a marble that one of the actors has, and it's put in one container, then one of the two dolls goes away, and when they returns, the child has to say whether the marble. There is also another version of it that is even more insidious with Smarties and chocolate. And then the child has to basically say and figure out what the doll that didn't see what happened in her absence. So the other doll actually misplaced the ball or the chocolate in another box, where the doll will, think that the chocolate or the marble is. And the failure is in actually the child that fails this task says that the doll that didn't see and didn't hear what happened in her absence will actually look for the marble and the chocolate in the where the misplacement was happened instead of the original one. And so this is taken as a failure of figuring out what the other is actually thinking about, having a theory of thinking in the other person. And so the general assumption in the theory of mind regarding imagination is that the deficit is related to this failure or an underperformance in the theory of mind test. It comes with a deficiency or impairment in pretend play. And in general, the autistic children display less symbolic, creative imagination. Now, one consequence of looking at this as deficit is what Milton, a scholar who himself is autistic and as also a child who is autistic, calls the double empathy problem, in that we already know that it's difficult for autistic and neurotypical people, individuals, to communicate and understand their reciprocal communication. But the fact that you add also a vision of deficit on top of that adds another layer of difficulty and mismatch in communication, where the two parties have to negotiate even more assumptions from the other side and even more trying to figure out how to communicate and clarify ideas about themselves or about the other. And this problem has some relationship with the autistic disorder, as is it called, in terms that in the more clinical, medical oriented research and healthcare, the inequality in health services, the stigma and other consequences of looking at this as a deficit and a disorder, at this way of being, comes with an enormous inequality in terms of strain, in terms of services, and in terms of stigma also that comes. And if you can see the score of inequality in terms of health and well-being, you can see that there is, and where one is kind of, you can read it as a very high score of inequality, you can see that autistic individuals are far worse off than a non-autistic individual. Theory of mind is still a very mainstream, a very influential view of autism. And I'm not here, it's not an attack on theory of mind, but it is a critical view on the role of imagination itself and how it is seen in autism. And there is quite a bit of empirical evidence that counteracts this view of imagination in autism. The first is logical evidence. If autistic, and this is in a wonderful book by Loftis, if autistic truly have a deficit in theory of mind, then why it is that neurotypicals find it so difficult to intuit the intentions of autistic people? In other words, is there a deficit in theory of autistic mind that they actually is specific and unique to neurotypical individuals, so they cannot figure out that they don't have a theory of mind of autism or autistic people? And then the other one by Milton himself, basically, this is a long quote. I'm not gonna, you can read it, but basically what he says is the people that actually are trying to figure out the others are mostly the autistic individuals that try to conform to neurotypical individual culture. And so yet they are seen like the ones that have a lack of understanding of neurotypical mind. Now, one of the major empirical, so database argument against the vision of imagination anterior mind, as seen, for example, by Baron Cohen, has been put forward by Morton R. Gersbaker at Wisconsin University. She's almost a Nobel Prize in memory research. And this paper that I'm putting the information of the paper because I really want you to read it, and basically this is a large review. I cannot even, make it justice. They have reviewed and done also meta-analysis on hundreds of studies. And what they find is that there is a lack of validity and a lack of replicating. So basically confirming the seminal findings in the 80s by Baron Cohen and regarding the universality of failure in autistic children and individuals and the specificity. So, saying that, only all autistic people and just the autistic people, so specific, unique to autistic people and individuals, they have a deficit in the theory mind test. And what happens is there is a lot of evidence outside the theory of mind line of research that shows that instead autistic people of all ages can understand other person's intentions, goals, and desires. And one of the most important things is they have to have some clear perceptual, attentional cues to actually do so in the situation and context where they are interacting with the others. But most of all, the factor that seems to predict, so they explain all the data in the theory of mind test, is language. And so the level of language is predictive, and it features very much in how the test is performed. So there is a lot of evidence, for example, that younger children, and not only autistic, don't understand the final question, which is the key one, regarding the intentions of in the complex scene is actually the thinking needs to be figured out. Is Sally, Anne, or the experimenter? And this is also overshadowed by the use of pronouns like she during the task. And now some other experiments outside of the line of Baron Cohen and friends have shown that coaching simulation actually can induce correct behavioral responses. But then when you ask the child whose intention or what is being asked, they actually give the answers listing all the thinking of all the actors, including the experimenter. So the way that the child frames the task at the beginning seems to be actually the most predictive one and is connected with the level of language and communication. Now, if we look at examples of research that compare creativity and imagination in autistic children and neurotypical children, then you can see clearly that there are differences, but the results don't support the idea of deficit. So this study is very interesting, and I think one of the best examples of the literature right now. There was a large sample of kind of middle school and preteens, autistic and neurotypical children compared on executive functions and two imagination tasks. One, it was a verbal, so the generation of novel metaphors, where they had kind of a STEM completion task, where they had to form simple metaphors or similes. And then figural, which is the non-existent object drawing test, where they were asked to draw a house first and then now draw a house that doesn't exist, an house that you invent, or some other instruction that is basically a paraphrase of novel, non-existing. The results show that the autistic children had tended to have a slightly lower executive function and fluency scores and lens comprehension of conventional metaphors, but they generated more novel metaphors than neurotypicals and had better understanding of them. Also, in the figural drawing task, they tended to have more mental synthesis. So they were combining, for example, different animals, parts of different animals in one novel drawing of an animal, for example. And what is interesting also that what the results showed was a different style in doing the task. So, for example, for the metaphors, the children, the typical developing children were relying more on executive functions and this flexibility and switching. The autistic children instead used a language-based executive functions skills. And this is important because also shows that there are particular skills and communication styles switching through ages and age dependence. I will talk about that shortly. Now, looking at pretend play, the key piece of information that is always comes up always, and it's looking at, for example, that large map of the bibliometric literature, existing literature on imagination, is basically the most cited paper, of all literature, is this review that came out from Gerald in 2003, where the findings were, yes, general behavioral observations and measures show that autistic children display less pretend behavior, and so quantitatively they play less pretend play. There is a score of quality that tends to be on the lower end of subjective quality of pretend play. However, one big issue with this research has been the misinterpretation of the conclusion that Gerald himself drew from the data, from the results. So if you actually look at his words, what he actually concluded, he concluded different things. He didn't conclude deficit. He discussed the deficit as a possibility, but he concluded for a different type of social and motivational explanation for less pretend play. So not a deficit of imagination, but a reluctance to engage in play by autistic children, which could be explained by other things. For example, the double empathy problem. One particular aspect to consider is that almost any perspective or imagination that comes from psychology, behavioral sciences, and neurosciences are influenced by the view of the classical theory by Vygotsky, where basically pretend play is the vehicle to the genesis of imagination. The origin of imagination is pretend play. Even though the particular mechanism, cognitive mechanism, the machinery or the format that allows this transition from pretend play to become imagination is different in the two authors. So Piaget thought about imagination as the initial stage for forming internal mental symbols. Vygotsky emphasized language as the main key player in mediating this transition. They both thought that communication was a key aspect of play. Now, Piaget had the idea of egocentrism, and the Vygotsky was actually opposite. We know that there is a blend right now. There has been a lot of research that shows that these are not mutually exclusive. But one of the more interesting research lines are in biology, where the links between one leads the other, imagination to play or play to imagination, has been kind of a little bit debunked. And if you look at all animals, including humans, this imagination, communication and play, they develop a little bit more independently and in parallel rather than feeding into each other. So you can identify different forms at different times in the developing organism, and they don't come with the others, although skills in one tends to be at the same level than the other. They are related, associated, correlated. But all of them are also correlated with a common ancestor, a common root, which is survival. So from the biological lenses, what actually predicts, what actually tells you about pretend play in across species is that the ones that play most pretend play are also the ones that tend to have a better success survival rate. And so that could be actually the root cause of the development in the three things. Communication through imagination doesn't necessarily require language or verbal communication. Examples are, for example, in the very nonverbal figurative savants like Nadia Chomsky, which was a child which was nonverbal, but it had an intense production of horse drawings. And this was produced when she was between 3 and 5. And then the very famous Stephen Wildeshire, which is, a very well-known artist right now, and he has sort of a photographic drawing memory of large cities like London and Paris, and he, is one of the very, very quoted artists and drawing. But also this comes from ages ago when I did my undergraduate research. I had the opportunity to work with a child that was a nonverbal autist and autistic child, and he was also completely blind. And the way that he actually communicated was drawing tactually with relief plastic, mylar plastic sheets. And so that was one way in which he could communicate with people. Now, another thing that is interesting, and this is my son, Matteo, who is also autistic. And the one important aspect of imagination is that it can be transferred through the body and through the way that he's communicated. He had this, at one point in his development, he had this generic pointing. It was not related to attention. It was not context specific. And it tended to be related to something that he was thinking, and he assumed that you had to know. And this then carried on his drawing production, because this is ads. And what you can see is that there are ads, like, a very stereotypical type of drawing of the eyes and the ad. But then another important thing was the having hands moving exactly as the pointing and the moving of his arm. This is an earlier drawing just to draw the contrast. So, this was drawn when he was like 3 years old, and this is more, 4 years old. So there was a complexification and also a dramatic change in how the ad. It was a deliberate, addition of the ends, and you can see this even further, the arms moving as is developing the drawing. Then this also generalized to other themes like Spider-Man. And Spider-Man, of course, one of the most important tools that he has is the webs and his hands. So they are featured everywhere in the body. But then also generalized to this is PJ Masks character. What is it called? Catboy. And then you have also Mickey Mouse representations. And then later, you can see it in the human figure, and in a self-portrait, again, you have that generic nonverbal index. And what does that mean? Well, in this case, and this is true for Matteo or for, some autistic children, it's not for everybody, of course, but it does give an insight on some aspects of imagination. Imagination is highly complex, can be also in sync with language. So it's out of sync of the language skills and verbal skills, but still retains communicative aspects. So, for example, building a narrative structure and using utterances as a social tool because to drawing attention, but also the style of play that Matteo has had, which was very on movement, very, gross motor, and using pointing, was also matching the style of imagination in products like drawing. And so there was an intrinsic correlation between the two. Now, one aspect then that you can draw from the example of Matteo is as a case, and there are others, of course, but this is kind of an example that I want to use to bring you in, is that the generic nonverbal pointing is actually an very inclusive theory of mind. It's not that Matteo didn't have a theory of mind. He had a theory of mind that didn't have a boundary between him and the other person. So he was assuming that you would know what he was his generical pointing and what he was meaning to tell you, right? The communicator. So that's a giving for granted that the other has a theory of mind. This is a quote that basically summarizes what I'm saying from the philosopher Alvanoe, which is, very, very poignant and kind of puts this in better words that I'm using. And then when there is this mismatch between what is actually this over-inclusive theory of mind and the behavior of the other, the parents or the caregiver, then we have the problems. Then we have the tantrums, we have, persistent behavior and that type of things. It's the assumption for Matteo and autistic children like him, young children, that you don't need to communicate because, the other should know, that is the root of this kind of dialogical and relational type of communication. Now, between 1964 and 2025, as I showed you, roughly 600 papers focalized explicitly on imagination, but only 2 actually took in consideration explicitly the investigation of the experience of imagination, or consciousness, or what is actually the experience of the child. And so it is that lack of understanding that we don't actually have. It is that lack of empathy into the feeling of the experience that we don't have. And it's incredibly important to actually reach that empathy of the other. And so one way to approach that maybe is neuroscience. Neuroscience has a long history of measuring brain activity during mental imagery, which I explain is the basic level, the requirement, the necessity that we put in imagination. And so very interesting things happens when you look at it through that perspective and lenses, because you can see connectivity differences here. There is a huge meta-analysis that I did with my students regarding the activation in the literature of using functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what you can see is there is a difference, and there is an over-activation in children that are autistic and individuals that are autistic, and different connectivity, a different way in which functionally the different areas that specialize in generating images actually talk to each other. And there are differences in connectivity anatomically in the activation. So, for example, the autistic children and individuals tend to actually have more areas that have to do with the difference between imagining something interoceptively, so into the body, and outside the body. But they are not really showing the same type of activity at the same level for other areas that are involved in neurotypical individuals. And then, of course, and this is where my research focus is now very intensively deployed, is words are also understood through imagery. So you form an image of an apple and something more abstract like love to understand a sentence when you're reading or when someone is speaking to you. And this is a window in how we actually, the imagination becomes a window in understanding, in a window for understanding the processes of understanding language. And so that can be harnessed for intervention, therapy, whatever, help, support. And what you can see from this, these are different levels of a movie going on in the brain, electrical activity that we use to do with a method that is particular extraction of features of electrical activity. And when it's mapped, you can see that, and looking at the various neuroscience evidence, evidence of the styles of imagination in autistic and neurotypical individuals, what you see is that the autistic children and individuals always use the more complex network functionality to imagine abstract or concrete words, whereas the neurotypical have this differential pattern and they have a less complex connectivity for concrete and then a more complex connectivity pattern for abstract. And the important thing is that there is also changes in age in terms of how imagination is used. And in general, what happens is people move away from visual and episodic sensory information, and they actually go to more abstract language-based type of imagination. And this has a lot to do with autistic styles and traits, because one of the aspects that changes, that we have seen changes with age, is that there is more likelihood that imagination is like a form of verbal synesthesia, which means the sensory perceptual things are actually thought in terms of language. They are translated in terms of language, and then there is a loss of consciousness of using images, which is called aphantasia. I want to conclude now. And so, as I said, some young autistic children have a particular style of imagination which suggests over-inclusivity to your mind, not a deficit. And pretend play is highly complex, specific in autistic, and it's more difficult to decode because it's not necessarily in sync with the language system, but it still retains communicative aspects that can support language. The style of play also matches the style of imagination when you use the body, when it's an embodied type of imagination. And nonverbal communication features can feature in imagination using the same type of building language, grammar, and syntax, like, for example, building the initial parts of structure of a narrative or a discourse in understanding text. Now, neuroscience evidence also shows that there are changes towards the language side with age. So what I think we can do with this is that we can reframe our idea of autism, our understanding of autism, and we can use it in a lot of practical ways as parents, but also as caregivers. We can adapt or accommodate our practices to accommodate this idea that imagination is one very useful and one pervasive aspect in autism that can be harnessed. One way in which you can do it, for example, is reframing the meaning of repetition or behavioral repetition, because rehearsal is very important for attention and is very functional, adaptive, actually, in some aspects that are novel for autistic children, and for imagined interactions with the others. Imagination then becomes a tool where you can actually use it to reduce or eliminate this double empathy problem. And this is, of course, contributing to where we are going as a country, as for our national autism strategies, where we want to have a more comprehensive understanding of neurodiversity. And I want to really thank all my students in the CHIO Nicer Club crew and my international collaborators. Thank you very much for your patience and listening to me.
All right, Amedeo, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, that was very, very fascinating. I feel like I need to go back and re-listen to everything just to truly absorb everything you were discussing. So thank you for that. Amedeo, I'm going to start with some questions that were pre-submitted to the presentation when people were registering. So I want to give those people the props for being ahead of the game. One parent or caregiver would love to know if there are some ideas to bring others into play and to not have withdrawal. So can you speak to that a little bit for a sec?
Well, I think there are different ways of doing that, and there is a very interesting book. It's called Integration Play Therapy. I can give it's full of ideas. One very really interesting one is to start with children and peers that have some understanding or have interacted with autistic children. and actually leverage the fact that autistic children really play well with other autistic children, and then model that by integrating in children that may be siblings that are non-autistic. It's always this communication issue. If we bring down barriers in communication, and that's my idea, right? Then you can help support children to actually get into it, right? And be engaged. One thing that I have to say is if the child shows that they are not engaged, from my perspective of imagination, that might just be a behavior, but not what they are actually experiencing. So it's very important yes, there is withdrawal behaviorally, but try to actually, if you can, communicate and understand what is that the child is thinking in that moment. Because it really truly may be that it's not really a real withdrawal, but it's a thinking about it, right? A persistence, a type of repetition that is functional at that particular moment. But anyway, I have a few resources. If you can reach to me, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, and we can definitely circulate those to the group afterwards as well. So thank you for that. The other question that came through in advance is from a pediatrician, and they would love to hear insights on imagination versus hallucinations or delusions and how to tell those apart.
That's a very interesting question. And I've been thinking about that. And I mean, the reality is you are having a delusion right now, right? Perception is an hallucination. The only difference is that you have some feedback. Right. So you can tell, oh, OK, like there is light, I can cover my eyes and it changes. Right. But one interesting thing is that I learned when I was in graduate school is that the same parts of the brain are used by hallucination, imagination, and sight. So if you ask a person that is hallucinating to imagine, that tends to stop the hallucinations. This is really true with Alzheimer's disease, for example, the later stage. So not that I'm saying that it's always about Alzheimer's, but it is very documented in neuroscience. And so if the child can stop voluntarily by generating images while having the hallucinations, you have basically a tool to tell whether that's reality, where they are actually telling you something about perception that they are really perceiving or imagining. And so you can create a contrastive test. But what does it matter? An hallucination is real to the person that is perceiving it. So it's actually very interesting to have a sort of a cognitive interview guidance to actually make the two different things. So if a child or the individual can actually metacognitively, so at the cognitive level, make a difference between what is perceiving and hallucinating, the hallucination is under control and there isn't any issues. So the only thing that could be really unsettling is the anxiety of the person that is perceiving lack of control of these images, like when you have a PTSD, for example.
Fascinating. Amedeo, you're blowing everybody's mind today on a Friday that everything's a delusion. All right, I'm going to go to one final question right now, and then I think that's all I'm seeing coming in. I think you already started to touch on this in one of your slides, but I'll read the question anyway that I think came in before that. So I've heard mention that some people do not have an inner monologue or have less of an ability to visualize things internally, such as not being able to picture something in their mind's eye. Has there been much research done on this, and does it have an impact on imagination or communication?
Yes, it does. It does. This is very interesting. There are two main explanations. One is obviously a deficit, as always. So this is an inability, and people have through plasticity compensation, they go to the verbal. Right. Another one, which I am actually studying with one of my graduate students, Dana Weimark, is that we use images, but we are not conscious of them. So it is not true that we are not able to have a dialogue, but the dialogue has become so automatic in our use, so fluent, that we actually don't detect it at the level of consciousness. It's like you know that you are seeing right now, but you are not questioning it. So you are not metacognitively, in analyzing everything that you are looking at very, very, in a very aware way. You're just simply doing it. And so that's the same. But yes, it does have a tremendous influence in how you organize memories, because Dana's thesis shows that there is more organization and more control when you are actually don't have images, which you are exerting more effort in structuring perception and memory.
Fascinating, fascinating. All right, I see Stelios' hand raised. So Stelios, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question, and maybe we'll give you one of the last words here as we wrap up.
Sure. If there's no other questions, I have one. It's more of a practical question. Amedeo, this was a fascinating presentation. Thank you for all the work that you do and your leadership. I thought it was very interesting how you talked about the way we neurotypicals make assumptions about the process in which autistics make or don't make assumptions. So I thought that was very nicely done. So the practical question, and you hinted at this towards the end of your presentation, is we are thinking about a campaign to raise awareness and reduce stigma as part of national efforts in Canada, but even local efforts. What would be your 30-second message coming out of this work, using the imagination lens? What would be your message to the population of Canada? What should we be thinking differently based on this line of work?
Well, the main thing is that children can play and can imagine. They imagine differently. That's all. And trying to actually get to know them. And you know what? We are in the best position ever. We are far away from Vienna of Asperger, right? People are accepting. It's just they don't know. Right. And so it is just an awareness situation, because they don't live the experience of having someone with autism in their family. Right. I know, because I've seen the shift in myself. Right. And so having the idea that children can do things, it's just they do it maybe differently. It'll take a little bit more time and more patience. I think it's just what we're actually do, because also the other children are very accepting. And they get it. So I think this is the beginning.
Well, I think that's a very powerful message, Amedeo, and what a better way to end our session today than those words that you just shared with us. Thank you again for everything, an amazing presentation, and I'm sure that this will trigger further discussion within our community.
Thank you so much for your time and attention. I really feel honored to be part of this. Thank you.